Hi everyone, we are here at the last lecture of the semester. We are going over the last two chapters of the Whelan book, and I think it wraps everything up pretty nicely in terms of, especially in the conclusion where he discusses some kind of big issues, but I also think he answers them in a way that truly helps you understand just how important understanding, at the very least, what these different facts and figures can mean and how statistics can play a role in either answering these questions or at the very least giving you something to question or to put into perspective when thinking about all the different things that go into these questions. So let's go ahead and get started. So, in terms of program evaluation, Whelan ends by talking about the types of experiments that you could essentially have as a researcher, at least some of them, and kind of like the benefits and the hindrances and things to think about. And of course, the kind of the top notch, the best possible scenario in terms of a research experiment is a randomized and controlled experiment, right? Where you have this large pool of participants and it's completely randomized in terms of how you set the treatment group and the control group. And that's what you're looking for, right? You're hoping that in terms of demographics, everything gets spread out somewhat equally. And that's kind of best case scenario. We're going to get into all these individually, but that is kind of like the pinnacle of what you're looking for when you're running an experiment. We're also going to talk about natural experiments, non-equivalent control, and then looking for difference in differences. So, like I said, when it comes to randomized controls experiments, this is the optimal way to create any treatment and control groups. And it's to distribute the study participants randomly across the two groups. And he gives a couple of examples, right? The first one he talks about is a surgery case, right, or the experiment, where there was the control group who didn't get any type of procedure, right? They had, in fact, the surgeons went in and just kind of put in some markings on them and stitched them up, but didn't actually do anything invasive. And then there was a group that actually had a procedure done, and it was for trying to figure out if there was an actual benefit to this procedure. And it came to find out that there was no actual benefit, no further benefit either way. So that was the example of that, but it was a randomized and controlled experiment. Then they talked about the Tennessee Project STAR, right? This is where they wanted to see what the effect of having smaller classroom sizes and or having a teacher with some sort of teacher aid to help when you have larger classes. And it did show that there was a difference, but the problem or something to think about when you do have these randomized controlled experiments, especially when you not necessarily get out of academia, but when you're trying to fund these type of experiments, they can be very expensive when you're trying to go for a quality experiment like this. Now, there is one way that researchers do try to circumvent the cost of something like that, and that's trying to find a naturally occurring event, right? So in this situation with the natural experiments, that's exactly what researchers are trying to do. They are taking advantage of something that's naturally occurring. Oftentimes it's because there's some sort of legislation that's passed or some rule that's been passed, or some policy that's put into place, and you can just take advantage of the fact that something wasn't happening before or wasn't required before, and now it is. The example they gave here is Adriana Yera Muni's minimum school law study. Right, she was looking to see if there was a connection between a required number of years that you had to go to school and then your success afterwards. That's an example of again, like you have a particular policy that was put into place, and you have the benefit of looking back at the data and seeing, was there any significant change because of this policy that was put into place? The next type of experiment, we have non-equivalent control. So there are still two groups, there's treatment and control. It does leave room for bias, right? So this means that this is not completely randomized, right? You are kind of looking at, you have somewhat more of a control as a researcher in terms of who gets put into these groups. And the example they have here is the Dale and Kruger Selective College University Study Test, right? So they looked at two different groups. Everybody involved in the study had been accepted into an elite or selective college or university. And then there was a group that decided to go, and there was a group that decided not to go and attended somewhere else. And they wanted to see if that going to a selective school had any benefit for you long term. And there was some minor statistical differences. The big difference they saw were for students that were coming from a low income. But that is an example of when you don't have a completely randomized test, right? You specifically chose the participants that were part of your study. Next, we have the difference in differences, right? So this is where you look at the before and after data of after a particular group received a treatment. Then you look at the same data for a similar group that did not receive that treatment, right? So the thing you have to consider when you're looking at things in this way, where you're trying to find the difference in the differences, is that you can't really account for sometimes the other interventions that may have played a role in some way in the differences that you're seeing, right? They did give an example here of the discontinuity analysis, or how I think of it, kind of the just barely. So when you're looking at the before and after, and not necessarily the before and after, but when you're trying to figure out who you're looking at in terms of the data, they talked about, I think they were talking about summer school, and instead of looking at just two different groups, you're looking at the group that did qualify and the group that just barely missed whatever the factor is, right? So for them, if it was the folks that failed and had to go to summer school, and then the folks who just barely passed and still went to summer school, and there you're getting a little bit closer in terms of the qualifications of the group, and it helps a little bit when you're looking for the difference in the differences. So that is chapter 13 in terms of program evaluation. But one thing to keep in mind when you're looking at all of those different examples from that chapter is that these researchers are trying to find the best possible tool or method to answer the question that they had, right? So even if it's someone who is looking at old data and trying to study that, right? Because that's an option too. I think oftentimes when we're thinking about a research project, we're thinking of something where we are the ones that are conducting the study. But I know I had a colleague during my doctoral program, and right around the time, I think it was a year before he started working on a dissertation, they had just made all of the email exchanges from Enron public. And so that was his research data. He didn't have to interview anybody. He didn't have to poll anybody. He just grabbed all that data, and that was kind of what he was looking at. And so that's a benefit. That's something that you can do if you're a particular question you're trying to answer and there's already research that's been done for you, you can use that data if it's available to you. So in terms of the conclusion, Whelan asks a few questions, and I think it's helpful to think about the way he responds here. So he talks about what is the future of football, and he talks about all these different competing studies that are being done to look at traumatic brain injuries that are happening when it comes to football, all the different cases of players suffering from Alzheimer or dementia at a much higher rate than the general public. And at the same time, understanding that there is a league who it behooves them to make sure that players can still play, right? They only make money as long as players are playing football. I'm a huge football fan. I think, obviously I've mentioned fantasy football here on our lectures before. But that is an example of someone, because now the league is obviously trying to make efforts and trying to focus in on player safety. But I think looking at all the data and what the relevant data is and what do we do with that, right? I know a number of people who've told me that they just can't watch the NFL anymore because of the fact that they know that there are all these consequences that are happening to them afterwards, even though, of course, players are making their own decision with their lives and their health. But there's some folks who just don't like that connection and knowing what has been happening with some of the former players. He asked the question, what, if anything, is causing the dramatic rise in the incidence of autism? And I think that section of the conclusion was really great in talking about some of the misinformation that gets put out there because of the and we've talked about it in previous chapters, the correlation doesn't equal causation, right? There are a number of things that have changed over the last few decades in terms of the reported incidences of autism. And so some folks are trying to find different things that might be the cause of that, but just because there's correlation doesn't mean there's causation. There's a lot of bad misinformation coming from that. Whelan asked, how can we identify and reward good teachers in schools? I think this was a really good chapter in understanding that getting a particular number or a stat is helpful, but it can't be the only thing that you're looking at, right? Because then we have to ask, how was the study done? What were the tests, right? Because they were looking at I think the value added for teachers is what, we're not accounting for all the different variables that could have been part of the scenario, right? Like, he even talked about broken air conditioners because obviously if people aren't comfortable, they're not going to do as well. The stress factors are going to be a little bit higher. But understanding that, and especially if you talk to teachers, right? When you have a test and you're expecting all students to be successful at this particular test, you have to also question, is that test something that is not necessarily fair, but is it accounting for all the different learning styles? Because there has been a ton of research to show that every single individual has a preferred learning style. And are these standardized tests a way of really truly evaluating who is and who is not a good teacher, what schools are good or not? What are the best tools for fighting global poverty? I think the one section out of this part of the conclusion that really stuck out to me is when the researchers, the award-winning researchers, looked at the farmers in Kenya and realized that if they got a little bit of a subsidy when it came to fertilizer, that the crops were much more successful. I think there was something like their use of fertilizer increased by 10 or 20%. When you realize, like, of course, it is almost impossible to just hand out free money to people. But if you can find out small little ways of making improvements, then you can find ways of increasing productivity and production. And just in general helping people by finding these small little things that make a difference. I know there is a professor who I had class with when I was a master's student at UTEP, Dr. Arvind Singhal, and he has this idea of positive deviance, where you're trying to find, okay, if all of these individuals or community members all have the same resources and kind of the context is all the same for everybody, but there's one particular individual who is succeeding when all the others aren't. What is the positive deviation that they are going through that is causing that positive change? And can you learn from that and then spread it across the board? And I think that section, when it came to global poverty, the question of global poverty, was really great in the Whelan book. And then who gets to know what about you? And I think that's a great way of ending the book, especially now that even more so we're finding out what companies are doing with our information. I think I got a kick out of that story about Target and the dad who had no idea that his daughter was pregnant. And it's true. All these companies, whether it's Netflix, Hulu, Target, they are looking more and more at the information. And because the technology and advancements and innovation when it comes to technology and data and the internet they've moved so rapidly that legislation and policies can't keep up with them just yet. We're reaching a real sticky situation in terms of what people are doing with their data. I know, like, there are companies like Apple now, when you download apps, it'll ask you if you want them to be able to track your data and your information, but there's still only so much control that we have. I mean, now when you sign up for a new program and it says, do you want to use Gmail to create your account, or do you want to use Facebook? And if you use Facebook, they get access to a certain amount of information. For some folks who really don't care, like, they just hit accept, and we have no idea what people are using our information for. But it is no surprise then that when you're scrolling through Instagram or Facebook, that all of a sudden you're getting ads for something that you were just talking to a friend about, or that you Googled a little bit earlier on a completely different device. So understanding that there is. And I think he ends it talking about, like, I think he said that there's he mentions 4 words like knife, fire, some sort of cream, and that they all have their own specific benefit, but used in the wrong way can cause a lot of damage. And I think this last question really sums up the idea that there is an invaluable amount of information about us just kind of out there. And there are some positive ways of doing it. I know they talked about, like, the companies that look at your DNA, they're able to connect family members, but there's also really negative things that people can use with this information, and we have to be careful. And as researchers, or even in our situation where I'm teaching this in a leadership program, and we as leaders are kind of like, the onus is on us to look at this information and make the best possible decisions with that information. And in my opinion, it can't be what's the best possible best possible decision to make that's going to make us money, because that's only part of being a leader, right, is being productive and increasing revenue and things like that. But I think more in general, like, how can we be good ethical leaders and be successful in that way as well? Not just about making money, but being a good, prudent company, making sure that we're taking care of our team members and making the best of the information that we have. So I hope you enjoyed not just this book, but I hope you enjoyed the course. I have had a fantastic time reading your discussion posts and watching your videos, and I look forward to reading your final papers. So good luck on your final papers, and thank you for a wonderful semester.